started. I don't know that I've ever just stood here for 10 minutes waiting on 10:10 before, but I have a sense that this is who needs to be here, so let's begin. We are, during the summer, there are going to be fewer of us. That's why we usually don't offer the program during the summer, but I just wanted to continue with Genesis because I think it's important. And the people that are here, the people that need to be here. Because there are fewer of us, you can afford to interrupt me more often. But please wait for the microphones because there still are a significant number of people who listen to the podcast. And so the reports I'm getting are that we are putting something up that people can hear all of. So that's the reason for the microphones. And well, we like to hear each other too, but please remember to wait for the microphone so the folks on podcast can catch it. Okay, so I'm going to run through June and then I'm gone in the month of July. Right now, I'm inclined when we come back to continue with Genesis. We won't have gotten through it. And these are stories I think we all need to know. And I've been frankly fascinated by how much it figures into the rest of the Bible reading or preaching or study that I do, just what we're doing. So I'm inclined to keep going when we come back in the fall. But if you're not, send me an email. I don't want to abandon you. There may be something else we could do, like analyze the political positions of the candidates for November. There are a lot of things to do. But I'm inclined to keep rolling on Genesis. So let me know if you think that works or not. All right. Also, I got this wonderful card from Sally. It's a birthday card, so she's 6 months, she's ready. But it's got a picture of the ark and the rainbow and 2 unicorns who say to each other, "Oh my God, I could have sworn he said next Thursday." So thank you for my card. All right. Join me in our prayer. God, by whom the meek are guided in judgment, and light rises up in darkness for the godly, grant us in all our doubts and uncertainties the grace to ask what you would have us do, that the spirit of wisdom may save us from all false choices, and that in your light we may see light, and in your straight path we may not stumble. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. All right, I very intentionally opened each class with kind of a review of what we are doing. The question that we're asking is it possible to find and follow a way of life? That is, can we find a way to live that fits who we really are, not some idol of who we might be, but who we really are, and perfects our godlike potential? That is, nurtures us into the growth that we make from the image to the likeness of God. So that is really the question that we are asking as we read through Genesis. And we've learned a couple of things from Genesis, I think. From the first creation story, we learned that order came out of chaos, but it did so by a progressive process. And that process involved separation and distinction. With each step of the process, God is separating one thing from another, distinguishing one thing from another. We also learned that human beings stand at the peak of creation. That is, they are the highest in creation. This is a very disputed point, but I think Genesis is very clear about this. That we, human beings, are the only godlike creatures who, thanks to our reason, our ability to think things through, also to imagine, are able to recognize a distinctive articulated order of things. That is to say, the world makes some sense. We can figure it out. Our brains work in a way that allows us to distinguish and separate what's out into the world, of course, and therefore we can figure things out. In the second creation story, we learned that human beings are also, again, thanks to our reason and freedom, the ones who are most capable of disturbing and destroying the order. So on the one hand, we stand at the peak of creation in the terms of our capabilities, and on the other hand, we're able to do a lot of damage with those capabilities if they're not aligned with God. There is some pride in our own powers that can destroy our perception of the world. Now, what I mean by this is that, was anybody here at 7:45 this morning? I don't think so. All right, what I mean by this is that we are made to look at the world the way God looks at the world. But in fact, we tend to look at the world through the lens of what the world can do for us. We tend to look at the world through the lens of what the world can do for us, which leads us to classify, objectify, put into boxes, limit based on descriptions of characteristics or beliefs or ethnic origins or whatever, to treat things through the lens of what they can do for us. I've given you the image of a cocktail party, right? I know you never did it, but I bet you witnessed somebody walking into a cocktail party, which was for business purposes, working the room solely talking to and talking about and for the purpose of trying to get business, right? So they're trying to do a power assessment of the room. They're trying to make sure they talk to the right people, and they're ignoring anyone else, which, by the way, I think never works, but that's a different issue altogether. That would be an example, a very practical example of looking at the world through the lens of what it can do for us. I'm arguing that every time we objectify another person or group of people, every time we think we know somebody by the worst thing they've done, we're doing the same thing. We're doing the very same thing. So what I want to do is describe this for you in a way that you can see and accept, not in a way that says, oh, those are bad people who do that. You with me? Because we all tend to do it. We all tend to do it. And of course, that means that what we're trying to do is learn how to not do it. Learn how to not do it. And I think that's really gets to how we pay attention, how we attend to things. You know, you've heard me say before, pay attention to what you pay attention to, right? And you've heard me say before that what we pay attention to tends to nurture that in whatever we're looking at. So I'm a big believer in appreciative inquiry, for example. I'm a big believer in the nurtured heart parenting method. I'm a big believer in management that looks at what people are doing right and tries to cultivate that, name it, reward it, resource it, and not spend all the time talking about what's wrong, right? I'm a big believer when you're riding your bicycle to look at the sidewalk you want to be on and not the crack. Because if you look at the crack, you're going to ride into the crack. I'm a big believer if you want to screw somebody up on the tee of a golf course, focus them on the water. It's my favorite. Don't worry, George, don't hit the water. Of course, the famous psychological experiment you've heard about is about the pink elephant. Don't think about a pink elephant, right? Don't think about a pink elephant. So what we attend to, we tend to find and we tend to nurture. So if we attend to the life in each other, then we tend to nurture the life in each other. If we attend to the sin, sadness, or brokenness in each other, then we tend to magnify the sin, sadness, and brokenness in each other. Right? Okay. So we have that very, very powerful capability. I, by the way, think that's what Sabbath is about, which I'll say more about later, perhaps. Sabbath is a liturgy. It's not a theory. It's not an idea. It's a liturgy that you go through in order to sanctify time, to draw closer to God, to change your perception of the world so that you can, more often anyway, look at it the way God looks at it. We'll come back to that. All right, from the fratricide of Cain and the warring age of heroes, remember we distinguish heroes from saints, that led to the flood, we're reminded of the dangerous tendencies of human beings, where we had those two lines, right? The line of Cain and the line of Seth, and we looked at characteristics of one versus the other, one of which I was claiming was a line of heroes, people that wanted to be the center of the story, that wanted to conquer and dominate others, and one that was a line of more saintly-like people, people that were not the center of the story, people that were focused on placing others into the center of the story, and how God looked at those two different ways of being. You might think about Maundy Thursday, where Jesus, remember, wraps a towel around himself and bathes the feet of his disciples, decentering himself, if you will, taking himself out of the middle of the story, kind of attacking a hierarchical order where they were to serve him and he served them, which is followed by what? Holy Communion, moving into a Eucharistic gathering, the whole purpose of which is to be in community and relationship of reciprocity with each other. Maundy Thursday, I think, has a way of pointing out and attacking a theory of domination and holding up as the norm, as the better way to live, a sense of reciprocal relationship. Okay? That's all I'm talking about here. I offer this slide just because I think it's beautiful, but also because it has Christ in it. So I love slides where Christ appears in Old Testament scenes. Not because I want to engage in some kind of supersessionalist interpretation where the Hebrew scriptures don't stand on their own, but because I think you can identify the presence of God in those stories, which through the example of Christ helps us see those stories slightly differently. Not than Jews, but than we would without Christ. All right, so Genesis 8, and Noah built an altar unto the Lord, and he took every clean beast and every clean fowl and offered burnt offerings on the altar. And what I asked you about this the last time we gathered was, what in the world is going on here? And can you remember a time when you expressed gratitude for God for something that seemed improbable? The real question is, if you wanted to express that gratitude for God, how would you do that? Noah did burnt offerings. If you do that, you're probably not going to admit it here. So what do you do and why? Somebody give me an offer.
Thank you.
John Bean is
when I started my recovery in Narcotics Anonymous and Alcoholics Anonymous, I was, it took me a minute to realize what was happening, but then I realized the level of grace that I had been given. And once I started to really understand, it took me a while because I wasn't sure if I'd be successful. And once 8, 9, 10 months into it, I started to really see that I might actually recover. I started to do service work in the programs, and I've done it on and off for like 20 years, volunteer and paid.
So your expression of gratitude to God for your own new sense on life was to serve other people. So you're assuming that that's what would please God, if you will. Yeah. All right. Anybody else?
Good morning, everyone. I'll just say from a monetary perspective, I make certain that I put specifically if it's a peace offering, an offering of atonement, an offering of thanks, and then I say, do what you will with it, but this is what, because I'm not able to do what they did in the old days, this is my way of, this is my burnt offering, this is my atonement, this is my peace offering, this is my thank offering.
So you're offering money, you're offering something of value that
Yes.
costs you some freedom, perhaps, and which is easily monetized, easily used
Right.
by others for, yeah.
And say, do what you will with it, but this is my atonement, this is my peace offering, this is my thanks offering. And I
Yeah,
label
thank
it in that way, and so that I know what it was used for. But, I mean, I have other ways, but as
Yeah,
a
yeah,
monetary
no.
way, that's what I do.
Thank you, yeah.
Is it working? I would say that a time that, decide what God might want is through the liturgy and through, I think, a lot of stuff with EFM and stuff like that. I came to the conclusion that we're all the same. And what has helped me when you do that is that you have a tendency to either forgive or forget things that in the past you might have felt slighted by, or, you would look for a reason why that happened. And generally when you do that, you might come at it with a negative perspective. But if you say, we're all the same, there's probably a reason this was done, let me move forward and forget it. So that's what I would say that God would want to do, is to, I guess, to be
Yeah,
more,
that would please God.
yeah, that would be more peaceful and more understanding.
So in that, is it fair to say then that you think that pleases God because it has an effect on the world that seems like what God would like?
Yeah, because I'm not stirring it up in some
Yeah.
way. I'm not going to some contentious situation. And I also think that I was having a lot of trouble with your earlier statement in your introduction about that God has created us with the knowledge of what to do. I think that's what you said. Something like that. We might have to check the tape.
God created us with reason, rationality, imagination that we use to do things.
Right. So that would, I would be saying that I'm trying to support what you're saying in that. By saying, if you come to this realization that we're all the same, then, and put it in practice, that would qualify as something that God created you to want, or gave you that gift to want, if that makes sense.
Yes, thank you. Thank you.
I just want to say that I struggle with the last question. The idea of me deciding what God might want. I feel like I don't know, but I mean, with concrete things, I think, the idea of connection, of exploring the mystery, of being open to something, in expressing gratitude, that makes sense to me. But having a certainty about what God wants, I don't feel like I know the answer to that.
Yeah, not so much. Yeah. No, that makes good sense to me, and it's probably why you're an Episcopalian. and it certainly makes a lot of sense when you watch people weaponize that, right? I know what God wants, and therefore you're bad. But, it makes sense when you watch it weaponize it. It's good to have humility. We do have to make decisions, though. And so if we're trying to align our lives with God, often we have to make a decision. That's what discernment is all about. And so what I would say there is, yes, thank you. And how did you decide what God might want? You still have to figure out how you go about discerning it, even while you maintain your humility, that at the end, not only do you not know, you might be completely wrong, because after all, we were wrong before, yesterday. Don't have to read much history to figure out that everybody thought they knew what God wanted, really didn't have a clue. And yet, we've got to decide what to do tomorrow. So how do we do it? That's what I'm trying to get at. So thank you. We need to hold on to the mystery and the humility of it.
I think I touched on this a bit last week regarding this or similar topic. The only perspective I have is a perspective of medicine. That's the area I come from. So it's quite easy in medicine, I suspect in law and other professions, to dehumanize. And what I mean by this is, in medicine, you see a human being in your room that you're taking care of and examining. It becomes very, very easy to think of this as an academic process of trying to figure out the disease. And I suspect in law that can happen. You get lost in the process and forget that there's a human being up there that's fate depends on what you do, but you're wrapped up in the process, which is your own ego. And so I think God would want us to not dehumanize, to look at each individual in a way that we're trying to do something to help that person be aware of their suffering or be aware of their circumstances, rather than an academic process of going through the motions. So in that way, I think that we can feel like that we're doing what God would want us to do, which is to be human and to recognize human suffering rather than our own little academic interest.
Yes, thank you. You're prompting me to remember a couple of things, one of which was my working in the hospital and realizing how often we would say, well, the broken leg in room 34, right? Because we're processing, we're trying to get it through. It's not that we're mean-spirited or mean to hurt anybody. Suddenly it became the problem you're kind of solve and you forget about the person. The second was that story, which I've told before, about the surgeon at Grady. Please nod if you've heard this story. All the years we've been together and I've never told you the story? So as told to me, Grady's a teaching hospital, so the surgeon is going with his crew, so all these medical students or residents who are following him around, and he goes into the room to see the patient who's got this terrible wound, and he asks the nurses to unwrap the wound so that he can examine it, and he asks the patient how she's feeling about it, and he kind of does whatever he's going to do to touch the patient, I'm sure in a sanitary manner. And then he says some more things, and then he has the nurses wrap the wound back up, and they leave the room. And the minute they hit the hallway, the residents are like, why did you do that? You didn't need to see the wound. We've got the data. All we needed to do is make sure whatever blood pressure's up or, that you're stable. That was completely unnecessary. Why did you do that? And his response was, always touch the wound. Always touch the wound, which I think works for all of us, right? Just use wound as a metaphor. That's what that patient needs to be seen and cared for and empathized with. You have to touch the wound. That's integral to the diagnosis, it's integral to the treatment, it's integral to the recovery.
So Thomas had the right idea, right?
What?
Thomas had the right idea, right?
Say more.
Thomas, the apostle, touching Jesus' wound.
Well, yes, John. So I'll leave you with the question, did Thomas ever touch the wound? You can go look it up. Yeah, did he ever touch it? But yeah, so I just want to underscore the point you were making, that there is this human-to-human contact, which is that we're talking about how we know things, I believe gets to how we know things. Like you don't really know somebody just based on data. Those are markers, but you only know somebody when you engage them. So yes, I think that's very good. So what I want to, well, you had your hand up though, Lisa, what?
Yeah, thanks. Just to comment on the second question, in speaking kind of a linear connection to what you were sharing about touching the wound, I was thinking of just an experience in life, I can speak for myself, where the unexpected could happen just in your day. Like I almost fell into traffic one time. I was crossing a street, and you don't think about the messenger or somebody that's going to help you, but it was a person. And, maybe any of us in this room can speak, sometimes we don't want to speak to the other person because they look a certain way or they're dressed a certain way or whatever. I could have cared less who it was, but they were my angel that day. It was like they touched my arm and they helped me across. So I don't know if that makes any sense, but it connects to that idea about, gratitude for something that God seemed to, that would have been improbable.
No, thank you. Yes. So I have this sense that gratitude is the cornerstone of the spiritual life. That gratitude is that place, at least for me, where it all seems to start and where I know I need to return to. Because if I don't know how to experience gratitude, I'll lose sight of the fact that life is a gift. And the minute I lose sight of the fact that life is a gift, I think it's mine to do with as I want and I can control it. So for me, that's just I always have to go back to gratitude. And if I'm not feeling it, I have to stop until I can find it, right? So I've told, if I'm counseling, when I've counseled people, for example, who are in some terrible moment in life, despair can be overwhelming, and often I will say, I want you to go find the something that makes you happy, that makes you feel good. And I don't care if it's warm water in the shower, but go find something that makes you feel. I don't use the word gratitude because you can't hear that. Something that makes you feel some kind of pleasure, some kind of sense of being alive, and then move from there. That's kind of what I do. So I think in the deepest of gratitude, when you really are feeling that God is present and you're feeling grateful for that, you also have an intuition of how to respond to God. Almost as if you don't have to think through it. It's not a diagnostic process. You have some intuition of that, right? Now this is an Anglican thought that is not shared by other religious traditions or even different denominations of Christianity, but I offer it to you as my own experience. That when I feel deep gratitude, I have some sense of how to respond to God in like kind lines.
Would you support that statement about other denominations or other groups don't really go with that idea? I think it would help us understand it better if we could hear the differences.
I was asked to lead a seminar once on discernment, because I've done a lot of work in that area, discernment, decision making. And this group, which I don't want to name, who were wonderful people, but they have been using a book by a brilliant author on discernment. And I've got my own model of discernment that I use, which is kind of contemplative discernment starts in stillness and close to God. You kind of rounding through a horseshoe, you get to a bottom where you're doing a bunch of analytical work, and then you're going back to the stillness and quietness of God to confirm your answer. That's how I think of discernment, okay? But in this book, it was a full 300 pages of analysis. So whatever you were doing here, there's a process you go through. Here are the questions. Here's what you do. Here's how you do it. Do this chart. Do this graph. Do this thing. They were really good. But I said, I can't use this book because I just don't believe in thinking that much, right? I don't think it's helpful. I think you wind up thinking about thinking and you miss the connection with God. For those of you who listen to my neurobiology, you wind up using the left side of your brain extensively, which is analytical and does all this distinguishing and difference making we're talking about, and not the right side of your brain, which is more holistic, where I think the Holy Spirit actually resides. So if you do all this thinking, you're going to have a real good sense of the best you can do, but you will not have expanded the best you can do. Because you will never have gotten back to any kind of spirit presence. You will never have gotten back to any real connection with God, and you won't have changed the way you're looking at the problem. You will just analyze it more deeply, right? So that's my own experience, but I would argue that you can feel this whenever you run into a problem that, whether it's in relationship or vocational decision-making on your own, where you just seem to be at your wit's end. You just seem to be lost. You don't know what to do next. And what I'm suggesting is the answer is not always to go to a piece of paper and write pluses and minuses and see which is more. It might be to pray, right? Or when we get to some tragedy. I wrote an article after some shooting when it seemed to me the reaction of the country was, we're sick of praying, we need to take action. And I wrote an article in which my thesis was, no, we need to pray. We need to take action. It's not pray as a way of running away from the problem, but if we don't get ourselves aligned with God so we approach this problem differently, we'll start to look just like the people we're against. Does that make sense? So I've got to find a new frame for this. I got to make sure I am aligned with God and act out of that, me, and not the one who's angry or afraid. Because if I'm acting out of anger or fear, I'm not going to solve this problem. I'm only going to perpetuate it. Does that make sense? So those will be several different ways in which I think the discernment process kind of works itself out. You got to go back and find the stillness that allows you to touch base with God. It's the same thing in the fishing story that I told on the front page, which is just a little ditty, right? Just a pedestrian moment, which I was a fool. I know people like to read about that. But it's the same thing. Like, life is going bad. It isn't working out the way I want. I start to take personal responsibility when I shouldn't, which is really just a sign of arrogance, if you think about it. So what do? You stop. Try to get still. Try to be open and available to God. Try to work out of that. And hopefully your frame of reference changes. More than you wanted, but hopefully that's helpful. Yeah.
So I think there's a great quote. I think it's by Howard Thurman that says, "Find the thing that makes you come alive and go and do that," which is, I think, his way of discerning.
Yes, and in that case, it is Howard Thurman. It is a great quote, and he's talking about vocational discernment. So many of us are more familiar with Buechner's image of vocational discernment, the wonderful, spiritually gifted Presbyterian writer who said, your vocation is where your greatest joy and the world's greatest need intersect, right? Which is a wonderful way of thinking about it. I'm a Thurman person myself. What Thurman says is just what you said, which is find what makes you fully alive. You know what the world needs? More people that are fully alive. I think Howard Thurman was a brilliant man. He spent a lot of time in the right side of his brain, yeah, or mind, yeah.
I think a lot of times we get into our routine and we have to do what you said. You have to go and do something else like fishing or so that you can clear your mind and so that you can, a lot of times ideas come to me when I'm doing something else than my routine in my profession. So I think, yeah.
Yeah. So Nietzsche has a great quote, I won't remember all of it, but paraphrases something like, nobody ever had a great thought without walking. Same thing, kind of let your mind will keep working. So thank you, that's good. Was there another hand? I'm going to move on. Lucy.
I guess you all see how I dress. I've been doing this since I was a little girl, and I don't know why. It's just fun. So forgive me for looking like this, but it's a pleasure to dress up. Now, I live next door, and I have 194 other people living there. I live alone. I have a big family, but I still want to be alone. There is a huge need next door, and I'm so aware of it, and I'm so eager to respond to need. So I do the best I can. But I can tell you, there is almost nothing that brings this feeling in me when a little lady comes to my door and knocks on it. I open it and she says, "Lucy, may I have an egg?" There's that much need. And I'm astounded. Someone's hungry. Someone's lonely. Most of the people there are lonely. And they go downstairs and they wait for someone to come and talk to them or sit with them. And so every time I go out and come back carrying something, I'm almost afraid that I'm going to see 5 people who need me, and I'm too tired, or it's too hard to walk, or I have a lot to carry. So I'm love being there, and I love the people, but it is doing something wonderful for me. It's bringing out my need to be helpful to people.
Yeah,
So
thank
I am
you.
grateful.
Thank
But-
you. And when Lucy says next door, she means the cathedral towers, right?
That's
what
right.
we're talking about. Yeah, thank you.
I've been reading a lot about the Enlightenment and all that's been going on. And if you tie it to Genesis, I mean, to me, the story of Genesis and most of the Old Testament is man turning from God, having a crisis, God intervenes. But every time, the crisis comes from man turning from God. Now, what the Enlightenment, if you study Hobbes and Smith, I think we all think they thought that human reason was great. They turned to human reason. This is going to be our salvation. But what they said was human reason is basically about self-preservation. So they set up a system. Our, quote, natural laws are basically a contract which says, in order to protect myself, I'll protect you. But again, it's human reason. And I think we're seeing that that's not really getting us where we need to go. And hopefully we're going to be in one of those situations where we start turning back to God rather than human reason. Doesn't seem to be working very well.
Right, right. So I would say yes. The way I would like to phrase it is, it doesn't work very well by itself, right? So, I'm talking about the different ways of thinking, different aspects of our mind. The way I think about it is, it's getting them to work together that is the key. So I want to start in that deeper mind. I want to come out to the more self-conscious mind, and I want to go back to the deeper mind, right? So it's about weaving it all together. So you could argue, if some have, that the Enlightenment, we just got so fascinated with our ability to analyze and create and develop and grow, that and the individuality and the rights-based principles that came out of that, we thought were the end of history, to interject an editorial comment. and maybe no, maybe all that was wonderful. I don't want to give back my iPhone, but maybe relying only on my iPhone is not going to give me the fullness of life that I need. And so, yes, thank you. I think that's very helpful. But I like to think about it as we just, got all fired up about our ability to do one thing and we forgot the other stuff, and that's almost predictable, right? Yeah, right. Lance.
I've been trying to think of something to sum it up in my own mind, just as a reminder, and I would say it's listening versus talking. Because your system where you're going to go to a therapist and you're going to go through, or you're going to go through this step, or you're going to do this, I think is all very helpful, but it's not listening. It's not listening. You're either talking and engaging, you're listening to someone else talk. I mean, someone else is talking to you. And so, still, be still and know that I'm God,
Right.
is be still and listen.
Yeah, thank you. There's real value in that. But so again, one theme that you will always hear me try to articulate is, I want to get past whatever binary we've set up. Right? We've been talking about differences and separation. It's good. It's analytically helpful. But it involves us always saying, not, I am not that. This is not that. That's how I know what A is. It isn't B. So I think all that's good. That's what language does in particular. But we're always trying to get beyond that binary. So listening and talking, yes, listening is undervalued. We're learning again how to do that. But at some point, talking's good too, right? So how do we not do just one or just the other? I had a friend that said, I just don't think you should go to lunch with anybody else and talk more than 40% of the time. Is that going to make it hard for both of you at lunch to adhere to that principle?
There's a reason God gave us one mouth and two ears.
Yeah, maybe, but if you don't tell me anything about you, I'm not going to know you very well, right? So anyway, yes, Lyons, I think that's exactly right. Same, it's a good summary of what I've been saying about the left, right, et cetera. All right, any other comments before we? All right, thank you. So you remember what's important about this Noah story is that God says, I'm not going to start over again, right? I'm not going to do this again. And I think it's because one way to interpret this would be God realized, if I start over again, this is just going to happen again. I'm going to have to start from here. And so he takes Noah as the bearer of virtue and starts from there. We talked a little bit about the truth there. You remember my favorite courtroom scene. And I want to say that one thing that comes out of this covenant is that is replacing the way of nature with the way of law, of understanding that we've got to have some boundaries, some rules by which we operate. And the paramount interest of that law is a promotion of human life. The paramount interest of that law is a promotion of human life. Now, I think this is exactly the point Jesus is making in our gospel today, right? We're talking about Sabbath. We're talking about this complex system of laws designed to help you adhere to the Sabbath as a community. Why do you have Sabbath? Promotion of life. So what Jesus is saying is, when you get caught up in all your rules, that becomes about power, not God. And if we focus on the promotion of human life, we're going to loosen up a little bit, right? If we focus on human life, we're going to loosen up a little bit. This is not I don't know what was happening in Jesus' time, but I know by the end of the 1st century to the 3rd century, this was a common rabbinic position. The rules of Sabbath had exceptions for the promotion of human life whenever that was necessary. You didn't sacrifice life for the sake of the Sabbath, right? So I think that's what the law of Noah is saying. And then the claim that I'm making, but the Bible is making, is that this law is universal in scope. It applies to everybody. It's not different in Somalia than it is in Peking, than it is in Berlin. At this basic level, it's the same for everybody, not a popular modern opinion. It is the biblical posture, however, so you can make up your own mind. How much do you have to accommodate culture when you're deciding what's right and what's wrong? How much do you have to accommodate culture when you're deciding what's right and what's wrong? As an example, it's easy, I think, when you're talking about murder, but maybe not. But my son, when he was in college, was writing his honors thesis on corruption, particularly in Latin America, which he thought was fascinating, until he figured out that what we think is corruption, they don't think is corruption. It's just called family. And what we think of as acting correctly, they think is ignoring your family. Different moral code. So how do you make sense of that? I thought that was even better honors thesis, and then he got preempted by somebody and just decided to enjoy basketball that year. Yeah. Look, can you wait on the microphone? Thank you.
Can't the law of nature and the way of the law coexist?
What is the law of nature?
Well, that's my question.
I mean, I think this far in the story, we're starting to see an argument that just letting things run free in nature gives you a kind of a chaos that winds up rewarding power. And that the law, the order that God is wanting doesn't reside solely in power, but also in equity, also in relationship, also in life. And so, no, you need to insert the law into what would naturally exist in nature. Now, this story gets a lot more interesting, as Randy was saying, when you get to the Enlightenment, start talking about natural law, because a lot of those folks are arguing that all the stuff already exists. But I think that Genesis has taken the position that and I think the line of Cain, when we looked at that, also reflected this conclusion that absent some law that protects humanity, you simply reward power. And that's not going to work out well, right? And so one way to look at our history of our civilization is to look at how what I would call a growing consciousness of the sanctity and dignity of other people has slowly changed how we think we ought to be structured. So there was a time when slavery was fine, right? I mean, go back to Genesis, when the Jews, in Exodus, when the Jews leave Egypt, what do they take with them? All their slaves. You don't have to go through much of history to see that slavery was just thought to be part and parcel of the way it was. People did not think that that was a problem. It's in fact justified. It's talked about with great relish. In our country, of course, it reaches its height with chattel slavery. But it's clear when you look at the history of our country that a whole lot of people thought that was fine for an awfully long time. Nobody was trying to cover any of that up. So I would argue that we've grown in our consciousness where we see people, humanity, humans, dignity that we didn't see before. And so that's caused us to question all of these constructs we have about right and wrong and what we can permit and not permit. And so here we are fighting these battles. It seems like they just come faster and faster and faster. In some category we thought was kind of wrong, suddenly we think, well, maybe not as wrong as we thought. Does that make sense? So I'm just saying I think all of that is about inserting some law that protects individuals, hopefully in community. Randy didn't say this, but Adam Smith, the great writer of The Invisible Hand, which is held up all the time for a celebration of market economies, but that was only one book he wrote. The other book he wrote was None of This Works If You Don't Have a Community Where People Take Care of Each Other. Adam Smith. We don't hear about that. But he assumed that was true, as did, I think, many of these Enlightenment philosophers. They assumed the presence of community and people taking care of each other, and then articulated this right-based philosophy. And then this community disintegrated, and we only had the right-based philosophy. Does that make sense? So I would argue that law of nature needs some work, if you will, and this is a beginning of, in Genesis at least, of a human effort to do that work. Somebody want to offer a different view, Bill? Well, or your own view. How about that? What would you like to say?
No, I was connecting this conversation with the gentleman over there who talked earlier, and I think over time, if you look at the long arc of human history, the use of violence and power as a way to resolve differences or to share resources has actually diminished over the centuries, relatively speaking. And that may be because as we've gotten more spiritually inclined, as we've accepted more of that diversity, of that spiritual inclination, the desire to care about each other on a human level has been growing. But there are always those moments where we slip and get a little bit too, I think the phrase you used was more about man and less about God, more about our own ego and less about the spirit. But it's kind of bending still on the long arc towards what you described, which is...
Towards justice?
Towards an order that's about human compassion and about human community rather than about power and what I would call greed.
Yeah. And of course, Stephen Pinker makes that argument in a book called The Better Angels of Our Nature, where he does all kinds of statistical analysis to show that we're better now than we were then. The pushback that he received from that book was, no, we're just more sophisticated in our violence. We crush people through economic systems. We don't need an axe anymore. I don't know. Okay, but I subscribe to your position. I think that's right, and I want to attribute it to a growth in consciousness. Yes. Yeah.
I'm not able to really articulate this very well yet, but there is still something about this concept of natural law or living by principles, and how do the principles actually govern your behavior, as opposed to a lot of things that I would consider cultural truths rather than more principally true, and how morality has gotten down into a place where we look at things on a certain level rather than keep reflecting back, as you said. And it's caused a lot, I know you can articulate this much better than I, but it's caused a lot of confusion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think my own sense is it's caused confusion because it's confusing. Right? We had this structure. You know, my father, who I loved, but he grew up in the 50s, and he thought the 50s was a great time. People in his town took care of each other. There wasn't this great disparity in wealth. There seemed to be a more wholesome existence. And he just was forever troubled that we don't have that anymore. I said, well, Dad, for you that was true. But there are a whole lot of people in the 50s who didn't have a voice in society. So it wasn't a better time for them, maybe. So we had this structure we were relying upon, and then the structure, it gets broken down. And there's a tendency, once you find fault with something, to destroy it entirely, right? And so I think it's a confusing time. And I don't know how to really make sense of that, except I ultimately find myself optimistic that what we are doing, the project we're engaged in here in this country and here in this place, is listening to more and more voices and trying to hold on to some fundamental concepts about how to live and create a broader, more inclusive, more sophisticated society. And that in that frame, then I look at things that seem very troubling, and I think I can place them in the category of this may kill us, but it's also a necessary battle to fight, because we've got to change that part of who we are without changing all of who we are, and that's hard work. So I believe the church has a real role in that, because I think we can be the caretakers of some basic sense of what it means to be human and what it means to be aligned with God and how we ought to go about approaching these problems. But the chaos is, we come by that naturally because we're changing all this stuff. You know, so when people get upset because we're rewriting history, it's like, yeah, we're rewriting history. When people get upset because we're breaking down traditional structures that have supported us for so many years, yeah, because we are. We are. And I think it leads us to be naturally nostalgic for things that seem to work. But when you examine those things that were working, often they worked in a narrower frame than we're working in. So it all gets very hard. But you're going to solve it, I can tell.
But I'm just going to share some information, which I'd be happy to share with the class. It was very interesting to me. Last week, a research project, the Pew Research, came out. They asked people, when in your life were you, what time period do you think was the most, where we had closest community, where people were most, I guess, committed to each other? And then what was the best time to be alive? And everybody thought, or when was the best time, not for alive, but for culture and music and art? They asked people from, I think, about 18 to in their 90s. Every age cohort said when they were small children, that was when society was the best, and people were friendliest, and people had the strongest community. They also said when they were adolescents was the time when music and culture and art were the best.
Well, yeah, that's great. That's great. And for those of us in the boomer generation, it's like we got our art and music our whole lives because we were this demographic bulge in the snake. So we've been pampered in that regard. But that's fascinating. That's fascinating. All right. It's now 11:04. So I'm going to skip all this other stuff. But and we'll move on next week, I think. I had just great stuff for you. But we're going to move on next week. And go in peace to love and serve the Lord.